March 2026, Southwest United States. Temperatures that should not exist in any month, let alone March, shattered thousands of daily records across a region already baking under a decade and a half of above-average heat. Scientists at Yale Climate Connections called it one of the 6 most astonishing weather events of the entire century. Not the decade, the century. And here's what makes that statement genuinely difficult to process. We are only 26 years into that century. The most extreme weather events in modern recorded history are not clustering at the end of a warming timeline. They are arriving right now, one after another, in a sequence that climate scientists are struggling to find adequate language to describe. This is getting crazier than anyone imagined. And the data that keeps arriving from every monitoring station, every satellite, and every research institution on Earth keeps making the same point more forcefully with every passing month. Let us go through what has actually happened. Because the individual events, looked at one by one, are extraordinary enough, but looked at together as a pattern, they reveal something that demands a completely different level of attention than most people are currently giving it. The March 2026 heat wave that engulfed the southwest United States was described by climate scientist Daniel Swain as the result of an atmosphere that has been structurally reorganized in a way that favors extreme ridges over the west. That is not language about weather. It is language about the fundamental circulation pattern of the entire atmosphere having shifted into a new configuration. Swain noted that the extreme upper ridge responsible for the event was intensified by a powerful North Pacific storm upstream, whose warmth and moisture added enormous amounts of heat to an already anomalous pattern. Preliminary analysis confirmed that March 2026 became the warmest March in the United States, recorded history going back to 1895. Not the warmest in a decade, the warmest in the entire instrumental record. Before the dust from that event had settled, the rest of the world was already delivering its own verdicts on what the climate system is doing. Finland recorded its warmest March in 145 years of meteorological history. 145 years. The country's earliest tick season on record followed immediately, a direct biological consequence of winter temperatures that never got cold enough to suppress insect populations the way they historically have. Algeria issued urgent weather warnings covering 19 provinces simultaneously as violent thunderstorms pushed well above 40 millimeters of rainfall across the entire northern part of the country. Brazil's state of Minas Gerais endured intense localized rainfall that triggered flooding and landslides so severe that the city of Juiz de Fora recorded its wettest month in recorded history, with more than 70 people killed in a single event. Spain and Portugal faced 9 named storms between January and March 2026, battering the western Mediterranean in a relentless sequence that forced over 12,400 evacuations in Spain alone, affected 115,000 people across 19 villages in the Sierra de Cádiz, and compelled the Spanish government to commit more than 7 billion euros in emergency aid. 9 named storms in 3 months. Infrastructure built to survive historical weather was failing repeatedly, and the people responsible for emergency management were beginning to use language that should stop every listener cold. We are witnessing a fundamental shift from isolated regional disasters to compound disasters occurring across vast geographic areas simultaneously. That assessment came from emergency management experts reviewing the first quarter of 2026, not climate campaigners, emergency managers. The United Nations World Meteorological Organization confirmed in January 2026 that the past 11 years have been the warmest in the modern era. 11 consecutive years. Each of the 11 years between 2015 and 2025 ranked among the 10 warmest in the entire instrumental record going back to the mid-19th century. And the ocean heat content data that underpins all of it showed 2025 delivering the largest single-year increase in ocean heat on record, the 9th consecutive year of record or near-record ocean warming. The oceans are not cooling between events. They are holding the heat from each successive year and carrying it forward into the next one, building a baseline of warmth that makes every subsequent heat event more extreme than the equivalent event would have been a decade earlier. The phrase the scientists keep using is compound events. A compound event is when 2 or more climate extremes happen at the same time or in rapid succession in the same region, multiplying each other's impact beyond what either would produce individually. A drought followed immediately by a wildfire season. A heat event followed immediately by a flooding event from an atmospheric river carrying moisture evaporated from an anomalously warm ocean. A cold snap driven by a fractured polar vortex arriving in a region whose infrastructure was damaged just weeks earlier by flooding. These combinations are what emergency systems were not designed to handle. These combinations are what is now happening with escalating frequency. Carbon Brief's updated map of how climate change is affecting extreme weather events, released in March 2026, now includes 232 new extreme weather events drawn from from studies published in 2024 and 2025 alone. Of those 232 events, 196 were found to have been made more severe or more likely to occur by human-driven climate change. That is 85%. Not a statistical edge, an overwhelming majority. The scientific attribution of extreme weather events to climate change, which was once a contested and cautious area of research, has matured into a discipline producing results of this consistency with a regularity that leaves very little interpretive room. The World Meteorological Organization has placed a 50 to 60% probability on El Niño developing between July and September 2026. If that development occurs at the pace and intensity that current Pacific Ocean temperature data suggests is possible, climate scientists warn that the second half of 2026 and the entirety of 2027 could deliver temperature conditions that exceed everything the modern record has already produced. The global average surface temperature has now spent 22 consecutive months above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That is the longest sustained breach of the Paris Agreement's primary threshold in recorded human history. And it occurred during a La Niña period, a phase that is supposed to cool global temperatures relative to neutral conditions. When the La Niña suppression lifts and El Niño adds its amplification, the baseline from which the next extreme events launch will be higher than any previous baseline. Yale Climate Connections placed the March 2026 Southwest heat wave in a list of the 6 most astonishing weather events of the entire 21st century so far. The list is worth sitting with for a moment. The Russian heat wave of 2010, which killed tens of thousands of people and produced wildfires that burned across Siberia. The Pakistan floods of 2010, which submerged 1/5 of an entire country simultaneously. The Australian summer of 2019 to 2020, which delivered the black summer bushfires across an area larger than many European nations. The Pacific Northwest heat dome of 2021, which pushed temperatures in the American Northwest and Canadian British Columbia past levels that had seemed physically impossible. The global temperature anomaly of 2023, which broke records by a margin that shocked the scientific community. And now March 2026 in the southwest United States, where an atmospheric ridge of a type that climate science says is becoming more frequent and more intense with every additional fraction of a degree of global warming, produced a month of heat unlike anything the instrumental record had previously captured. 6 events, 26 years. And the pace is not slowing, it is accelerating. Earth.org's assessment of the 16 biggest environmental problems of 2026 documented something that policy analysts have been reluctant to state as directly as the data demands. The undeniable reality of the climate crisis has not prevented its politicization. In countries, including the United States, a significant rollback of climate science funding, environmental regulations, and international treaty commitments has occurred at precisely the moment when the data is delivering its most urgent signals. The last COP summit ended without a mention of fossil fuel phase-out, despite pressure from more than 80 countries. 1 in 25 attendees represented the fossil fuel industry directly. The gap between what the science is saying and what the political response is delivering has never been wider. And yet the atmosphere is not waiting. The ocean is not waiting. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are not waiting. Cumulative ice loss from the world's glaciers reached a new record high in 2025. Sea levels hit a new record high in 2025. Concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide all reached record levels in the atmosphere simultaneously during the same year. Every single one of the physical indicators that scientists use to track the state of the climate system moved in the same direction at the same time. There was not a single significant indicator that improved or even held steady. Every one of them worsened. The agriculture sectors across multiple continents are now absorbing the compounding losses. Crops are being destroyed by events arriving out of sequence with the growing calendars that farmers have followed for generations. Planting windows calibrated to average temperatures and average rainfall patterns are becoming unreliable. Varieties selected for the climatic conditions of the 20th century are underperforming in the conditions of the 21st. Mental health services in climate-affected regions are reporting increased demand specifically related to climate anxiety and repeated extreme weather trauma. The psychological dimension of living through relentless, escalating environmental disruption is now large enough to be measurable in health system data. The question that the evidence demands be answered is no longer whether the climate is changing. That question was settled by decades of data accumulated before any of the events described here occurred. The question the evidence now demands is whether the pace and scale of what is happening matches what the world's response systems, its infrastructure, its emergency services, its agricultural networks, its public health systems, and its political institutions were designed to manage. Every metric suggests the answer is no. The response systems were built for a climate that no longer exists. And the climate that replaced it is not finished revealing how different it is from what any planning assumption anticipated. What is happening to the planet's weather right now was once modeled as a future scenario. The models were not wrong about the direction. They were not wrong about the mechanisms. What nobody fully predicted was the speed, the acceleration from one record to the next. The compression of what was supposed to be a gradual progression into a series of lurches that arrive before communities, institutions, and infrastructure have had time to absorb the last one. This is getting crazier than anyone imagined, because the imagination of what was coming was built on models of a physical system that turned out to be more sensitive, more interconnected, and more capable of rapid change than even the most urgent scientific voices of the last generation were prepared to publicly state. The data has now caught up with the worst case framing, and then exceeded it. There is one more layer to all of this that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it is the layer that connects every individual extreme event back to a single, relentless underlying driver. Every heat wave, every catastrophic flood, every record-shattering month of ocean heat, every fractured polar vortex delivering Arctic air to places it should not reach. All of it traces back to the same source. The accumulation of greenhouse gases produced by human activity is trapping heat that previously escaped to space, forcing that energy into a closed system. Most of it goes into the ocean. Some of it reshapes atmospheric circulation, and some of it produces the extreme surface temperature events that communities around the world are now living through at a frequency and intensity that simply did not exist in their grandparents' climate. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere crossed 425 parts per million in 2025. That level has not existed in Earth's atmosphere in more than 3 million years. The last time it sat this high, global temperatures were several degrees warmer, the Arctic was forested rather than frozen, and sea levels were significantly higher than any coastal city on Earth was built to accommodate. The planet is moving toward that state gradually, but the speed of travel has increased dramatically in the past decade. Multiple scientific institutions have confirmed that the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement threshold will be exceeded as a sustained long-term average before the end of this decade. Most governments are not on track to meet their climate commitments. The last COP ended without a mention of fossil fuel phase-out, despite pressure from more than 80 countries. 1 in 25 attendees represented the fossil fuel industry directly. The emergency management experts, who described April 2026 as the longest sustained period of extreme climate conditions in recorded human history, were not speaking hyperbolically. The 22nd consecutive month above 1.5 degrees, 9 named storms in 3 months across the western Mediterranean, 70 deaths in Brazilian landslides, 115,000 people affected by flooding in Spain. These are not isolated weather events in a world still behaving normally with occasional regional exceptions. They are the simultaneous expression, across multiple continents at once, of a climate system pushed outside its historical range by a specific, measurable, human-caused increase in atmospheric heat-trapping gases. The craziness that the data is now describing is not the end state of climate change. It is the early acceleration phase of a process whose full expression will be determined by decisions made in the next decade. The window to limit the most catastrophic outcomes is not closed, but it is narrower than at any previous point in the modern era. And the events of 2026, arriving one after another with a speed and severity that the world's emergency systems were not built to absorb, are the most urgent possible argument for closing the gap between what the science demands and what the response is currently delivering. The planet is sending a signal. It has been sending it for decades. It is just sending it louder now than at any point in recorded history.